In this video, I'm going to talk about setting up nested resources in Ruby on Rails and using a form partial and reusing the same form partial across multiple views in a nested resource in Rails. So this is one of those things that just continuously trips me up as I've been spending the last year or so learning Ruby on Rails development, and I just ran into this problem again and again, especially when I want to have like a parent-child relationship between two resources and setting up the form tag and the form partial across those different views. So when this happens, I try to really understand, how does this thing work, and document it so that I don't get tripped up on this again. And hopefully this video helps you as well. So I created a new Rails installation. I called it Nested Resources. And this one happens to be running Ruby on Rails version 6, which is currently in beta 3. But most of what I'm showing here should hold true for like Rails 5.2 and 5.1 and so on. I created a basic Rails install, basically listing out bands, and I can add a new band, and we can add a band, and then when we're viewing the band's show page, we can add albums to that band. So, and let's just add another one. What's another Chili Peppers album? Okay, so again, I'm viewing a show page for the band model or the band resource, and then on this show page, I'm showing albums by this band, and I'm listing out all of the albums by this band. I can add a new album right here from the show page of the band, or I can update the existing albums up here, right? So if I wanted to make an update to that, I can click update, and that has updated. I can also go to the album page and look at that, and I can also go to the album edit page, and that's where I can edit it as well. Now, this form of editing an album is the same form that is seen here and is seen here. In other words, I'm using a single form partial across all of these views. So let's walk through and just kind of pick apart the bits of code that make all of this work. So let's start by just looking at the root level, and we'll look at the routes to see how those were set up. Again, I had generated, in this case, I just generated scaffolds for bands and albums, and then I set up the routes like this so that bands are the parent of albums. In other words, a band, and let's look at the model now. If we open up App Models, Band, a band has many albums. And if we look at the albums, an album belongs to band. So that's the relationship. And what should we look at next? Let's look at the show page when we go to a single band. So let's look at the bands, and we're going to look at the show page, show.html. The notice at the top shows us, what happened after we submitted a form. Then we're looking at this band, the name of that band, and then we're saying if this band has any albums, and notice how we're able to do band, albums, any, then we're able to use this interesting partial to render out band albums. And this would actually render out a loop of all the albums owned by this band. And then down there, we've got the add album form. So we're rendering this form, which lives at albums forms, and then we're passing in some local variables. So that's a look at how this is built out. Now let's dig into, let me go back and just look at the controller for bands before we get any deeper. This was basically all generated by the scaffold in Rails. It's setting the band, at band variable on all of these actions. And when we're looking at the show page, you don't see anything there, but it is setting the band because that's a before action, which is defined down here. Band, find the band that we're looking at on the show page. All right, so let's go back to that show page again and look at this. So when we're doing render band albums, that's calling this album partial. So I created an album partial underscore album HTML ERB that's inside app views albums. So we'll look at that. And for every album that is created, it's going to basically display this chunk of HTML, and that basically represents this, what I'm highlighting here. We're linking to the name, and that links to the single album path. And we have to call in that band variable, app band variable, and album. The reason why album does not have an @ sign is because it's in this loop. So if you think of this like it's rendering albums as album, as you might see in other places, that is the variable for each instance that's iterating through this loop. So so then we can edit this album. Again, we're still viewing a single band page, but now we're up to the form that is embedded in this instance in the loop inside this page, right? So we're rendering this form, which lives in albums form. So that's a form partial, and it's a partial is indicated with the underscore at the beginning. So this is the form, and you'll notice that this is the only form partial that I have in the whole folder for albums. We're using the same form code in basically 3 different places right now. We're seeing it here where we're updating an existing album on a band. We're seeing that same partial down here where we're adding a band or adding an album to a band. And if we view a single album and then go to the edit page for it, so now we're at bands, 5, albums, 9. This is that same form again. And that's all coming from this piece of code in the form partial. So let's break this apart a little bit. We've got a form width. That's the newer version of the form tag that I think started around Rails 5.2. And then in parentheses, we're going to call a model, and it's calling band with the @ sign because this form would always be referring to the band because an album belongs to the band. And then I'm using an album variable here without an @ sign. And this is something that has always sort of tripped me up. If I'm looking at the single album chunk of HTML, and which again is this, and we're rendering that form, we needed to pass in album. And album, this version of the variable is how it should be when you're inside this, when you're iterating through that loop, right? So we want this version without the @ sign to be passed in to the form partial, just like that. So this word is basically this word, and it will represent whatever you define here. Another thing that I always like to check when I get a little bit tripped up on this is to view the source, and I'll just clean this out a little bit. And just look at the elements, and then view the source of that form, and I'm going to look at the form action, and I want to make sure that, in this instance, this action should be pointing to an album that belongs to a band, and it's this band ID and this album ID. That action URL should look like that. And if we look at the next one in the list, it should be the same band but a different album. And you can see bands 5 and then album 10. And if we look down here where we're adding a new album, it should just be bands 5 albums. And we're not specifying an album yet because it does not exist yet. We're actually in the process of building that. So let's look at that version of the form now. let's go back to the show page down here where we're adding an album. We're using basically the same render partial for albums form, except this time we're defining album a little bit differently. We're using this. We're saying band albums build. And build basically means like we're building a new album that has not been saved to the database yet, and it doesn't even have an ID yet. That's what needs to be represented in albums. And so basically, once again, this we'll call the same partial, and it's looking at this. Again, like you could think of this like that's the same as this, right? But we're going to leave it like that so that we can use different instances of the same form. And let's just look at that third view once more. We're going to go to edit an album. If I click into a single album and then I go to its edit page, so now we're on bands, albums, edit, specifying the IDs in between. We're still looking at that same form, and we are now calling render albums form, same partial. This time, we're defining album a little bit differently once again. We're saying this time it should have an @ symbol because we're looking at a single album. And this variable is defined in the controller. I'm going to show you the controller in just a bit to finish this out. But again, in this case, this would be like the same as this. On this page, when we're looking at the edit page, this form is seeing this form with tag like this. But I'm going to undo that because we want to keep it sort of generic so that we can reuse this and just pass along how we want that instance variable to look in each use case for it. All right, so let's just sort of round things out and look at the controller for albums. Albums looks a little bit different from bands because albums belong to bands. And so before most of these actions, we want to set the band that the album belongs to, and we want to set the album. And you can specify only show on these actions. When we are in the edit screen, we are setting the band just like that and setting the album. And these are defined down at the bottom. So to set the band, we're going to set the band variable, and we're going to find it using the parameter band_ID. And the album is set. Again, we're going to do a before action set album that will go on the show and the edit. And again, like right now we're viewing the edit. So the album is set by looking at this band, which we've already defined, look at all of its albums, and find the one that has the album ID. And since we're in the albums controller, that's just ID. Now, when I initially created these resources, when I created albums, I added band references. And that's basically what created that column in the database. And I guess I should also mention, like, the reason why I set it up this way with these forms on each instance when I'm looping through all the albums while viewing a single band is, later on you could add some JavaScript or maybe use Ajax to hide these forms and just have like an edit link that would reveal the form and sort of do like an inline editing system. And that's a different video for a different day, but that's why you might want to have these forms sort of printing out on every instance of the loop, is so that you can sort of like click each item to edit it right there in line. Yeah, so that's nested resources in Ruby on Rails and dealing with the forms and passing in the correct instance variables to each of those form partials. Hope this was helpful. Took me a while to really wrap my head around this stuff, but yeah, hopefully this video will at least help me next time I run into it.